This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
For what must have been the 100th time that long day, I studied the second hand of my watch, a heavy blue-faced Bulova that my wife had spent way too much on for our first wedding anniversary. It had outlasted our marriage, and it was still keeping perfect time, which was no small comfort. It was now exactly 6:30. Time to go. I left my apartment, rode the elevator 11 flights straight down, entered the crowded sidewalk, shoved my hands deep into the pockets of my cracked leather bomber jacket I'd put on over my polo shirt in anticipation of the evening's damp spring chill, and strode quickly but uneasily north up Broadway. Quickly, because that's the way most of us walk in Manhattan. Uneasily, because I was meeting my oldest and honestly my only friend, who over the past several months had been rubbing me the wrong way, and I was having no patience for that. It was a lovely Friday evening in May, there on the Upper West Side. Storefronts, brightly lit below the varied facades of apartment blocks and office towers, aglow in the soft twilight. A seagull in slow flight, high in the pale violet firmament. The musky perfume of cellophane-wrapped cut flowers in plastic buckets, and ripening fruit brimming from their waxed cardboard boxes, all lined up on the sidewalk in front of the grocer's. Cafes spilling out of their wide-open doors and bursting with merriment, the faint, damp, briny scent drifting from the wide Hudson River 3 blocks west. Then, emerging from the roar of traffic, the gentle music from a solitary, wispy-bearded, aged Chinese busker in a cracked straw hat, squatting on a stool and playing an air hoop, bestowing a melodious, wistful touch to the clamor at the end of another day, of another week, the poignant ode to our common lot to which we have been delivered and are so briefly bound. I stopped, pinched a $20 bill from my wallet, and dropped it into the pilled red felt of his instrument's open black case. It was more than I'd earned since I'd collected on my last invoice 5 months before. I gave it unequivocally. There is no price one can put on such beauty. Besides, the old man could quite possibly be broke. I felt for him, the way things were going for me. One foot on a banana peel, the other on a bar of soap, as my ex might say, while not even trying to hide her slight southern drawl, as she had assiduously trained herself to do. I sometimes feared more than I was willing to admit that I might end up on the street. It would be a little too ironic, an architect who finds himself homeless. I set off again. I was suddenly in such a rare and buoyant mood that I began to believe that it could last, that my entire ordeal, like the wet and cold winter itself, was finally over. It seemed utterly impossible. It also seemed entirely true. If heartbreak can come so suddenly, then why not happiness? But when I arrived at the West End bar, my spirits sank. I stood outside for the longest time, people pushing past me in and out, seized by a strange kind of paralysis. I gazed straight through my ghostly reflection on the thick glass door, saw the blurry crowd, debated with myself if I could really go through with meeting Ralph. And it was not just because he'd become annoying. Ralph often annoyed me in the best of days. Nor was it because I'd had my fill of him. I'd simply grown accustomed to my solitary life. I'd enjoyed being alone more than anything else all this time, which wasn't saying much, but why spoil what little pleasure I'd had? I took a deep breath, let it out, pulled the door open, and stepped inside. I was determined to put behind me the isolation to which I had condemned myself. And not just for the past few months, but sadly, I'd lately begun to see for most of my life. I squeezed my way through a boisterous crowd of strangers. It was overwhelming, but that was not all. What I'd felt faintly the entire afternoon, and what had hit me seconds before, when I caught that glimpse of my untrimmed beard and unwashed hair in my reflection, looking like a madman. Only now did that sickening sensation, that dread, really sink its teeth into me. when I saw him, Ralph Keller, his back to me, hunched over the bar. I was dimly aware of some kind of dark aura hovering about him that I was about to walk into and be unwillingly enlisted to join some nefarious scheme of his. Ralph was never much of a schemer to me, so I hadn't anticipated that, and I certainly was in no frame of mind for any surprises. It was all I could do not to turn around and head back out the door. I just wasn't up for any of it, like someone about to go under the knife and suddenly waking up and wanting to stop the whole procedure. I reached for the bar and hoisted myself on a wobbly wooden stool on Ralph's left and settled in as best I could. It came to me that it might have been the gravity of his bearing that made me fear even more that there'd be hell to pay if I stood him up. "Take a look at this," Ralph said before saying anything else, elbowing in front of me a big gleaming coffee table book. I glanced at the title set in a large serif font, The Great Estates of the Hudson River. "I don't want to look at any book, Ralph," I said, elbowing it back across the sticky bar toward him. "Oh, and by the way, hello to you too." "You want to look at this one, Anderson," he insisted, pushing it back my way. "Trust me." I looked around the bar. There was no one else I wanted to see or talk to, except for maybe Ellen Reynolds, my ex. That wasn't going to happen. The sun around which my life had revolved for 14 years, 10 of them as husband and wife, had become a distant star, invisible to my naked eye. I like to think that I wasn't even looking for her any longer, that I'd finally decathected. That's the way Ellen herself might have put it to me. She was an esteemed psychotherapist in the psychiatric wing at the city's Lenox Hill Hospital, and occasionally let slip some of her occupational jargon when she was not at work, and perhaps even applaud me in an awkward, icy way, and with that fake smile that former spouses and lovers put on, pushing you farther and farther out into the ethers, which was exactly where I felt I was. There was no avoiding it. My life in that teeming metropolis had been reduced to a universe of one, a rogue planet that went by the name of Tim Anderson, aged 42, single or separated. I didn't know which, or if, in fact, there was any difference. I found myself at the West End bar because a couple of days before, Ralph had called me to say he wanted to meet me, to tell me about a spectacular restoration job, as he'd put it. It was all mine if I wanted it, and you will, as he'd also put it, want it. "I don't care how spectacular it is," I said. "I'm done with restoring anything. I've told you this before, don't you remember?" "Just be there," he said, 7 sharp. Then he hung up before I could get in another word. I'd known Ralph since graduate school at Columbia some 16 years before. He was there for business. I'd gone for architectural preservation. He'd come to the bar tonight in a khaki suit, which looked like it had been slept in, and not just for one night. The top of his white Oxford shirt was unbuttoned around his thick neck. The crooked knot of his red and blue striped tie had been loosened, and his sandy hair, which fell an inch over the collar, looked like it hadn't seen shampoo or a comb in days. His baby face bore no wrinkles despite our gradual descent into middle age. In other words, except for the suit, which might very well have been the only suit he owned, and the small beginning of a double chin that I noticed once when he glared down at the bottom of his empty glass, Ralph looked very much like he always did all those years ago at school. That Friday afternoon, in the hours before I was scheduled to meet him, checking my watch again and again and again, I would wander over to the living room window and gaze down at the swarming streets below. One time I had a Beethoven CD playing, his Pathetique Sonata, second movement. It was one of Ellen's favorites, mine too. I was hoping for a little stress relief, but the music brought to mind not just the sorrow of losing her, which I knew only too well, but also the sorrow I felt about being so much at odds with Ralph, which was new and unnerving, and also new and unnerving in its lingering effect, was being so much at odds with the work I'd been doing all my adult life, bringing old buildings or parts of them back from disrepair or ruin, making them look as they had when they'd been built 100 or more years ago, as if the long-dead occupants had just stepped out for a stroll and I'd sneaked in to do a little tidying up. I believed it noble work, an occupation approaching that of holy orders, and I'd poured everything I had into the perpetual and more often lost battles here and there to preserve what remained in the shrinking pockets of old New York, captured in the varied eras of architectural representation. Victorian brownstones, federal brick row houses, Gothic and neo-Gothic churches, and the occasional detached Dutch colonial, Second Empire, and Greek revival scattered in the outer boroughs, once remote from Manhattan and pastoral in Whitman's bucolic splendor. The idea of living in a time when these kinds of places were built and among those who had lived in them had long appealed to my temperament. I found myself a bit of a stranger in the present world. It was why I'd spent so much of my life immersed in antiquity and the picturesque, resurrecting, reconstructing, and preserving that particular, if not sometimes peculiar, way of being in the world and its architectures. In the homes of other people is where I felt most at home. The old world had a mysterious yet certain and consolidating influence on me like nothing else, a kind of enduring dignity and tranquility to which I myself aspired. It was a battle against historical amnesia, defended by the mere but evocative weapons of beautiful artifice, cherubim statuary, urns of aloe, fluted columns, festoons of grapevines and ivy, those tiny seas and antique window panes. Now the aesthetic lure of that fanciful golden age and the old places that had once captivated and sustained me for years had somehow left me wanting, but for what I could not say. I gazed down upon the throng below. I had to wonder, how was I, who by any means within my reach should be saving buildings from demolition or disintegration, or rebuilding them brick by brick, window by window, stoop by stoop, roofline by roofline to the original stature and beauty, how was I to preserve or restore anything when my own life had fallen apart? I could have been at the top of my game, and earlier I'd believed that after a brief spell of sorrow I would be back at it and continue my ascent, but it turned out that I could no longer bring to my work even a breath of acquiescence, much less enthusiasm, because there wasn't an ounce of strength or will or sense of duty in me to give. I glanced at Ralph, then the book between us that he was trying to get me to open. Ralph had already emptied a pint of Guinness. Through his pudgy, freckled fingers, I could see the tawny dregs at the bottom of the glass, the lacy foam clinging to the inside, along with a slight, slippery sheen in his eyes when he glanced at me with barely a nod to welcome me to this meager feast. He might have been there a while and had 2 or 3. It would not have surprised me. The bartender winged by, tossed a coaster in front of me. Ralph ordered another round, and I ordered what Ralph was having. I wanted to be quick about bracing myself for whatever he was going to try and sell me, get up the nerve to say no, be done with it, and then, when I'd had my fill of talking, which would not take long, march right back to my apartment, my safe harbor, my penitential solitude. Ralph once called it house arrest. I suppose he thought he was being funny, but he had a point. The only thing missing was the alarm band strapped around my ankle. I peeked down at my watch. It was now 7 o'clock. I'd give Ralph 15 minutes. He nodded at the book. Well? What are you waiting for? Let's get our beers first. I should think you'd be jumping all over this one, Ralph said. You can think whatever the hell you want. Thank you, he said. I will. And I think this is a damn good gig for you. I didn't say anything. In the corner of my eye, I saw him look at me, probably wanting to say something about what kind of curmudgeon I'd become since Ellen had left. I did my level best to ignore him as I watched with great anticipation our beers being poured from the tap. Guinness takes considerable finesse and patience to prepare properly, and I was glad to see the bartender making an effort. Ralph elbowed my arm. Hey, come on, Anderson. Open it. I don't have all night, you know. I let Ralph win. It was pointless to refuse. It would get me nowhere. When I opened the book, the spine cracked. Then slowly, turning the heavy, glossy pages, I found myself helplessly drawn back into that faraway but not forgotten world, as if the folds in my brain also cracked. In an instant, I fell under the spell of what I saw before me in the dim wash of light of the bar that was somehow tinged with a golden hue. There they were again, those colossal antique mansions, many of which I had once gazed upon from the Hudson River on those many summer Sundays when my father had diligently, if not coercively, tried to teach me how to sail and navigate the river's tricky waters in his pokey Danish folk boat. Then rose an ancient and buried distress signal that now drummed in my ears when I turned the page to one place in particular, and Ralph, looking at the photograph with me, had spoken its name at the exact moment I recognized it. Acacia.
That was The River Between Us, written and read by James Kullander. This is an excerpt of James Cullander's novel of the same name.
Hi, Jim. Welcome to the Strange Recital.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we just heard the first part of Chapter 1 of your novel, The River Between Us. Without any spoilers, can you give us a quick synopsis of the story?
Yeah, sure. As we just learned in the excerpt, the narrator of the story, Tim Anderson, is about to embark on an upriver journey. The journey is to restore an old Hudson River mansion that had been hit by a freak tornado. But for Tim, it's not just another restoration job. We find out that not only had Tim long admired this mansion when he was sailing on the river with his father, back when he was a teenager, we also learn that Tim has been to the mansion 25 years before. So it's also a journey into his past. Thematically, the story is about how our past returns to us time and time again. There's a kind of symmetry happening here. It was a storm that had first brought Tim to the mansion, and it was another storm that had brought him back. You could say that the fates have a way of setting things up for us in this way to get us to confront ourselves and our deepest wounds so we can heal and grow. Sort of like the ancient Greek philosophical idea of the eternal return, or psychologically, Freud's repetition compulsion. So the story is about how our past influences our present, particularly as it pertains to traumatic experiences. You know, as William Faulkner once famously said, the past is never dead. It isn't even past.
Well, full disclosure for our listeners, Jim and I have been friends for several years, and I read an earlier draft of the novel. I enjoyed it a lot on a number of levels, and not the least of which was the architectural detail. I know the book is still unpublished. Maybe give us a bit of history. What was its genesis, and where did it go from there?
I've lived in the Hudson Valley for many years, going on 35 years now, and I was always struck by these old buildings that lined the river. Years ago, there was an organization called Hudson River Heritage, and they used to offer every autumn a tour called Hudson Valley Country Seats Tour. It was a self-driving tour. They give you a map, and you'd go to these mansions. These people generously opened up their beautiful homes, and I was walking through them, and I was just awestruck about how these places have been generally well-preserved, sometimes not so good. Although I wasn't allowed to take pictures, I started to be captivated by what I saw, and I took notes, and I drew floor plans. And I remember thinking, you know, there's a story here, and I'm going to make one up. And that's where it basically started.
Architectural restoration's a fairly narrow specialty. Are you an architect, like the protagonist?
No, I'm not an architect. I once aspired to be one. I lost interest in high school because of all the boring mechanical drawings we had to do. I suppose it was part of the training, but then I didn't have much patience for that then. But I think I do have an architect's attention to detail, an appreciation for older places, and an affinity for classical design. In regards to research, I just mentioned those tours that I went on. I took some classes in classical architecture in New York City. I shadowed a historic preservation architect working here in the Hudson Valley. I read a ton of books, from how-to manuals to histories of old houses. And I have an old house of my own, so I kind of know what goes into keeping the places in good repair.
Yeah.
Well, I'm quite fascinated by the history of the Hudson Valley. Those giant estates lining the east side of the river in Dutchess and Columbia counties say a lot about the U.S. during the age of the robber barons. The west side of the river, where we are right now, was full of the struggling working class, many of them tenant farmers on land owned by the rich families across the river, a form of feudalism. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there was then, as now, wide discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots before the robber barons came on the scene. The early European settlers in these parts had the distinct advantage of getting land grants from the first ruling body in England and then the ruling bodies here in this country. Sometimes they just took land from the indigenous tribes that were here, and sometimes they worked out some kind of deal like they supposedly did in Manhattan. Then these landowners continued with a kind of feudalism they'd supposedly left behind in Europe, with tenant farmers doing all the work yet bringing in little money for themselves. In terms of being on the east side, they settled mostly on the east, I think, for two main reasons. One is it was on the same side as New York City, so it was easy to access by roads and boats and eventually the train. This was especially true before the bridges were built. The other reason, I think, is geologically, the east side is much better for farmland than the west side is. The land is relatively flat and good for farming of all kinds, as opposed to the more rugged and rocky terrain on the west side of the river. I don't know if this is another reason, but it's worth considering that the east side of the river has a much more dramatic views looking west across the river than the west side does looking east. On the east side, you can see the Catskills, to the west, which offer some mighty spectacular vistas and sunsets.
Let's get back to the excerpt we just heard. It's very evocative of the Upper West Side of Manhattan. A spring evening, a street busker, a crowded bar. You don't hurry, you take the time to really give us the scene. Is that indicative of the style of the rest of the book?
Well, the pace picks up the deeper you get into the story because the action of the story picks up. But in these opening pages, I wanted to set the scene, not only by what Tim sees around him, but also by what's going on in his mind. When the story opens, as you may recall, he's just spent a winter alone in his apartment in Manhattan after his wife had left him, not even venturing out much. So when he gets outside, it's almost like he's seeing it for the first time. He's overwhelmed but thrilled, like we all are when we first walk down the street of a city we've never been in before. And I wanted to capture in these opening pages a little of what that feels like. But there are other scenes in the book when time seems to stop, like when Tim is admiring the house or the landscape. It's what happens to us all in certain moments when we're surrounded by beauty. And I wanted to capture that feeling as well. And the other thing I wanted to say is I wanted to have the mansion itself be a kind of character in the story. And to do that, I brought it to life through Tim's eyes. The house is the stage set where most of the story takes place. It has problems of its own, and it also has some remarkable, beautiful features that Tim and I hope the readers fall in love with.
Also in that opening scene, it's quite clear that, of course, he is going to take the restoration job that his friend is pushing on him. But there's a love story involved that we haven't been introduced to yet here. So give us a few details about that part of the story.
This is really the beating heart of the novel in the framework of the restoration of the mansion. Not much further into the book, after the excerpt I just read, we find out that Tim has been to the mansion once before when he was a teenager, as I'd said. When he was there the first time, he met the mansion's owner's daughter. They were roughly about the same age. And when he goes back to the mansion, she's there. And she's grown up and she's beautiful. And so they kind of reconnect and they feel that they're reunion was fated and meant to be, which we all know is a very powerful and undeniable feeling. And they're drawn together by what they come to realize is a kind of healing journey. He, from this time he sank the boat and was humiliated by the mansion's owner and his own father, and she, we learn later, from having been raped by her father when she was very young. So they've come back, he from New York City, she from California, to the place where their individual traumas have happened so they can heal from them and move on with their lives together. This is what they're believing throughout the story, and all things go swimmingly until they don't.
So there's some exploration of class differences in the book. I'm wondering about your writing process. How do you go about balancing things like social commentary and technical detail against character development and plot? I imagine it's a control question.
Well, there's clearly a class difference between Tim and Sally. As I said, he grew up in a blue-collar family. His father was a contractor, and family lived in a small ranch house. Although neither Tim nor Sally really care about any of that, you do get the idea that Sally's father is not so happy about seeing the budding relationship between Tim and his daughter. Initially, Tim thinks it's because he feels he's not good enough. So some of what we see in Tim is envy. The beautiful details he observes in the house and all the renovations projects he's worked on reflects a kind of deep, if not troubling, want for what he does not have. This is part of his motivation for wanting to get involved with Sally. It's not all of it, but it's there.
Now, there's also that psychological dimension. Even though the architect Tim Anderson is about 40 or so, there's an element of a coming-of-age story in the book as he has to face those difficult memories from his youth. So say a little about that journey for the character.
Yeah. After sinking his father's boat, having a near brush with drowning, and then being humiliated by the mansion's owner and his own father, Tim shuts down a part of himself, some essential joy of life and exuberance. He's lived like this ever since. It's as if a switch had gone off in him, and we learn later in the story it's one of the reasons why his wife left him. Something about him was absent to himself. This often happens after a traumatic experience. You disassociate or compartmentalize or disown that part of your life, but it's just not possible. So the thing troubling you is always there, buried deep in your subconscious, yet in many ways still running the show.
As far as a so-called genre, I would say that this is definitely a literary novel, not a mystery or a romance. We don't care much for market pigeonholes here, but what are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, it is a literary novel, but I also wanted it to be a commercial success. These are pretty much the sorts of novels that I generally like to read, not always, but most of the time. And while writing the novel, I even found a book called Hit Lit. It's kind of a play on words for chick lit, I believe. It's a sort of guidebook on how to write a novel that's both literary and popular, and it gives some examples like Gone with the Wind, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Exorcist, The Godfather, Jaws, Presumed Innocent. I read them all, and they really are well written, and in their day they were also runaway bestsellers. The Godfather, for example, has sold up to 30 million copies since it was published in '69, and if you look on Amazon, these books are still selling briskly.
Yeah.
So I was hoping mine would fall into that category.
Well, our podcast tagline about questioning the nature of reality sometimes gets set aside for the sake of shining a light on work that deserves to be known. Although it could be said that the wealthy class and their mansions are certainly outside my reality.
Well, in the novel, the question about reality is not about wealth or class, but about what's really going on beneath the surface between Tim and Sally and her father and mother, and even between Tim and Ralph. For Tim, the sands are always shifting, which he doesn't like. He's a buttoned-up kind of guy and likes to be under control of himself and the world around him. Yet, as much as he tries to get a grip on things, the rug is always being pulled out from under him.
What plans do you have for this manuscript next? Do you see it being available to readers sometime soon?
Right now, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I had started soliciting agents right around the time COVID hit, and I've not really gotten back on that horse since, and I'm not sure I even want to. The book is long, so it's unlikely that a mainstream publisher is even going to touch a book that long by a first-time novelist. I have a few independent publishers in mind, or I might just self-publish it and go from there. I don't really know right now.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I know you're also an essayist, but is there any more fiction in you that wants to come out? Novels, short stories, flash fiction about space vampires, anything like that?
Or even a series. Tim Anderson restores one mansion after another, having new adventures every time. Murder, politics, crumbling mansard roofs.
I don't know about a series. That book was pretty long and difficult to write, so I think I'm pretty much done with fixing houses, at least in the fictional world. I've turned my attention to writing a Substack column on my observation of what's been happening here since COVID. The column is called Underlined Sentences. And I've also just starting on a nonfiction book about solitude and about how to be alone without feeling lonely. And that book is tentatively called A Field Guide to Solitude.
Wow, okay. Well, Mr. James Kullander, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, and good luck with your novel.
You're welcome. I appreciate your time.
If I decide to restore my house to its original glory as a 1957 hunting cabin, I'm afraid it would mean going seriously backward.
Sometimes backward's the best direction. To lose is to win. This is The Strange Recital on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was from Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8, Pathétique. This is episode 25061.